Shalom Havrim, James Trim here, and today we're going to discuss Yeshua and the temple tax, uh, the holy half shekel. And this is covered in a section of the book of Matthew, chapter 17, verses 24 through 27. And I think we'll shed some new light on this event for you and garner information about Yeshua's halacha concerning the temple tax and shed some light on this text of the Ketuvim Netzarim, the writings of the Nazarenes, based upon information, knowledge of the ongoing conflicts and debates about the halacha surrounding the temple tax that were ongoing between the Essenes and the Pharisees during the Second Temple era, and we're going to see that that information is going to shed a great deal of light onto this passage for us. So go ahead and turn to, or actually, we have handouts for everything. If you are on Nazarene Space, or we'll have a link in the description of the video to the link where the handouts are. On Nazarene Space, where you'll have this video embedded, and directly underneath me, you'll see a hot link that'll open a PDF of the handouts. So the first handout is titled Yeshua and the Temple Tax, which is really our overall topic. And so we're going to get started in just a minute. Before we do, up at the front of this video, before I forget, I want to encourage you to please donate to support this work, not just the videos, but the blogs that we write, and the ongoing projects that we have, reconstructing the Halacha of Yeshua, and the Scripture Restoration Project, and the restoration of the ancient sect of Nazarene Judaism. And you can do that by donating by PayPal to donations at wnae.org, and there will also be a link at in the description of this video where you can donate. We can't do this work without your help, and it takes hours of research and time to put these videos and these materials together and to do these projects. And unfortunately, or fortunately, well, unfortunately, certainly, my wife is disabled. That's unfortunate, and she's chronically ill and suffers chronic pain. And because of that, I'm home as her caretaker. That's unfortunate. The fortunate thing is that I have an abundance of time working at a table about 6 feet from her bed that I can put into doing this work. But unfortunately, we have to eat and pay our rent and such. So if you can donate to donations at wnae.org, or click on the link at in the description of the video, then make a donation. We certainly would appreciate it. All right, and with that, we're going to go right into this with the first handout. If you don't have the handouts, you can also just look at Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 through 27. And this is going to be a really good example of midrash. And by midrash, I don't necessarily in this case mean allegorical material or homiletical material, maybe. But what I really mean is just that the word midrash comes from the word drash. The word drash is a word that means to thresh. It comes from a root meaning to thrash, as in taking wheat and just thrashing all of the grain out of it. And so you have this idea of taking the text and thrashing it and getting all of the meaning out of it, getting every little bit of meaning out of it. And Midrash is from Drosh, if you will, with the mem beginning. So it's a noun taken from that root, from Drosh. Okay, so in Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 through 27, we read, and when they had come into Capernaum, they that received the drachma came to Kepha and said to him, does your rabbi pay the drachma? Now, why would they ask this question, first of all? Let's continue. And he said, certainly. And as he came to the house, Yeshua prevented him, saying, how seems it to you, Shimon, the kings of the earth, of whom do they receive the tribute and the custom? Of their own children or of strangers? And he said, of strangers. Then Yeshua said to him, if so, the children are free. But in order that we may not provoke them, go you to the sea and cast the baited net, and take the first fish that comes up. And when you have opened its mouth, you will find a litra, and take it and give to them for me and you. That's Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 through 27 from the Hebraic Roots Version. So there's a lot of things that we can derive from this text. One of the things is that this can be helpful in chronology. This is a helpful text in chronology, which is helpful in setting together a harmony of the Gospels and dealing with Gospel chronology. And it will be helpful, it is helpful in the project of restoring the original of the Gospel according to the Hebrews, because this text gives us a very good clue as to the chronology of events. And in fact, we can tell exactly what date this took place. We could debate about the year, but this took place leading up to Yeshua's execution and crucifixion, and it took place around the 25th of Adar. And the reason we know this is because that's the date that they began to collect the half shekels from the people. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute, actually. So that's just kind of a preview, but that's telling us that this is happening towards the end of the month of Adar, which means that this event is only a couple of weeks, about 3 weeks, really, about 3 weeks before Yeshua's death, crucifixion. And that's interesting because what a lot of people don't realize is that the three synoptic gospels concentrate primarily on the last year of Yeshua's life. And in Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 through 27, this text is actually taking place in the very last days of Yeshua. Not long before, it's taking place after Purim, if you will, and not too terribly long before Passover. Okay, so that's one of the things that we can thrash out of this piece of text is a chronology and a date for this event on the Hebrew calendar. And in addition to that, there's other material we're going to thrash out of this text of the Ketuvim Netzarim, of the Good News according to Matthew, which is also, by the way, called the Torah of the Messiah, one of the ancient names that the Nazarenes had for this text, for this for the book we call Matthew. Okay, so let's go look at the Torah and what the Torah says about the temple tax, and then let's midrash on that text, see what we can learn, and what it will tell us about what's happening with Yeshua here, and what Yeshua will then be telling us about this text. All right, so Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 through 16. And Yahweh spoke unto Moshe, saying, verse 12, when you take the sum of the children of Israel, according to their number, then shall they give every man a ransom for his soul unto Yahweh. When you number them, that there be no plague among them, when you number them, this they shall give, every one that passes among them that are numbered, half a shekel after the shekel of the sanctuary. The shekel is 20 gerahs, half a shekel for an offering to Yahweh. Every one that passes among them that are numbered, from 20 years old and upward, shall give the offering of Yahweh. The rich shall not give more, and the poor shall not give less than the half shekel, when they give the offering of Yahweh to make atonement for your souls. And you shall take the atonement money from the children of Israel, and shall appoint it for the service of the tent of meeting, that it may be a memorial for the children of Israel before Yahweh to make atonement for your souls. By the way, this is where we get we have a lot of law in the United States, and really going back through British common law goes back to the Torah. And this is where we get a cultural principle whereby we look at the age of 21 and above as a level of adulthood. Now, we also use 18 for other purposes, and different numbers for different purposes, but a very common number in American law is 21. And the reason for that is, of course, the ancient Hebrews started counting at 1, not 0 like we do. So when a person is born, we don't say that they're a year old. We say that they're 1 month, 2 weeks old, 1 month old, 12 months old. Really, until they're 2, we tend to talk in terms of months. But in Jewish thinking, the person is a person from conception, and at birth, they're already counted as being 1, even though there was only a 9-month gestation period. They're 1 year old. And so 20 years old by Hebrew reckoning is 21 years old by American reckoning. And so we get our idea, ultimately, I'm sure it's not direct, well, it may be direct, but we generally get our concept of the age of 21 being the age of majority based upon this idea that we have here, where the census of who's and of Israelites is men who are 21 and older. Okay, there's a lot of material in these verses, and there was a lot of debate in the Second Temple era about how to understand them. And even though well, let's just move on to the next handout. You'll notice that before I do that there's a lot of italicized terms, bold-faced and italicized here, and almost bold-faced and italicized the whole thing, with all this, because there's so much that the ancients comment upon, and that they key in on certain phrases and derive some ideas from them. So you probably want to take this handout, and if you printed them out, set it aside and keep referencing it as we go on to the next page of handouts. Because now we're going to look and see, the next handout is titled Dispute Between Pharisees and Essenes. There was a dispute anciently between the Pharisees and Essenes on Halacha concerning the temple tax. And we're going to find out as we look at this that they each scrutinized the text in different ways and brought out different elements of the text that brought them to different conclusions. And from our text in Matthew 17 that we were looking at the very beginning, we're going to learn two things. One, we're going to learn which side Yeshua came down on this. Interestingly, we'll find out that Yeshua came down on the side of the Essenes on this issue, which is unusual because on most issues and in general thinking, Yeshua came down on the side of the school of Hillel Pharisees. But here, in this case, and in a handful of other cases, in this case on the issue of divorce also, he agreed with the school of Shammai Pharisees and with the Essenes against the school of Hillel Pharisees. On the issue of taking of oaths, he agreed with the Essenes on not taking them, on building a hedge about the Torah in this case, and avoiding not taking, not avoiding taking, making vows. So the dispute between the Pharisees and the Essenes here was that the Pharisees believed that you paid the temple tax once every year in the month of Adar. And the Essenes believed that you paid the temple tax once in your lifetime. And they had different passages. They didn't just, they didn't just make this up. They each were interpreting the text in different ways based on different passages. But more than interpretation of text is involved here, because when Moshe came down from Mount Sinai with the Torah, and the Torah included this text that we were just looking at in Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 through 16, and it talked about paying the temple tax. The people knew, Moshe knew, whether it was paid annually or once in a lifetime. And so that information would have been passed along with the actual written Torah. The written Torah is not clear, as we'll find out. You can look at the written Torah and you can dispute. You can take the written Torah and look at it and come to the conclusion that the temple tax is paid annually. You can also look at the Torah, the written Torah, and come to the conclusion that the temple tax is paid once in a lifetime. This is why we know the Karaites and the Sadducees are wrong, because just looking at the text, either one of these could be right. Fortunately, we have the Messiah as Nazarenes to tell us the answer, and fortunately, he also gives us the reason, because the Essenes don't really give us the reason. It's remez, it's implied, but Yeshua makes it pretty clear. So, in the Mishnah, in Tractate Checklist, now let's talk about Tractate Checklist for a minute. There's an entire tractate in the Talmudic literature, the Mishnaic and Talmudic literature, the rabbinic literature, that follow the tractates of the Gemara and the Mishnah, the Tosefta, whatnot. There is an entire tractate that deals with the temple tax called Shekelim. As you may know from other videos or from other teaching or just from your own studies, not every tractate of Mishnah is represented by Gemara. What is Mishnah and Gemara? See, sometimes I get to teaching and I assume that everybody knows terminology and knows what these things are, so I should pause, put a pin here, and explain. The Mishnah was written around or codified around 250 CE, and it is it's a record of the oral law, but there's more to it than that. There's two kinds of oral law represented in the Mishnah. There's oral law from Sinai, and there is oral law that is the rulings of the rabbis, i.e., the rulings of the Sanhedrins, on issues that came up, because the Torah tells us that if an issue comes up that isn't covered in the Torah, in the written Torah, then you bring it to the elders, and originally they brought it to Moshe, but if it was too hard for Moshe, they brought it to the elders, and this council that was set up would give a ruling, and that ruling is called in Deuteronomy, in the Torah. We'll do a whole video on that on another occasion. Okay, but that's another kind of Torah. It's not the same thing as that which came from Sinai, because maybe it didn't come from Sinai. Maybe some complex issue came up later and had to be resolved. There's all kinds of issues that come up in Torah as you actually try and put it into practice that the written Torah didn't cover. For example, let's say there's under certain conditions, a thief must pay back sevenfold if he's caught. And so the question arises as a matter of Torah. If I borrow money from Shmuel, or let's say I borrow, let's say I borrow a rare book from Shlomo. I borrow a rare book from Shlomo, and the book is stolen from me. And then the thief is caught and has to pay back sevenfold. Now, does that mean I owe Shlomo, because he sold the book, does that mean I owe Shlomo the value of his book because I borrowed it and I got to return the same value back to him? And I get the rest of the sevenfold, so this sixfold, if you will, increase. I get the increase, or does Shlomo get the increase? The Torah doesn't really answer that question, and so and that's one of many issues that come up in every day, and it gets situations come up that are even more complex than that. That's the sort of thing that we're talking about here. Okay, but I digress. Let us get on to the Tractate Checklist. So there is a Mishnah Tractate Checklist. The Gemara to the Mishnah was written in 400 and around 400 or so, or 500 and so, respectively, and it's the commentary by later rabbis on the Mishnah and their debates about issues that are laid out in the Mishnah and their commentary to them. Not every tractate in the Mishnah is divided up into tractates, and the same tractates that the Talmud is divided up into, the Gemara. The Mishnah plus the Gemara is the Talmud. There are two Talmuds. There's the Babylonian Talmud. Well, first there's the Babylonian Talmud is more authoritative, it's later, and the Jerusalem Talmud, which is less authoritative and was earlier. The Jerusalem Talmud was the opinions of the rabbis that lived in the land of Israel, and the Babylonian Talmud is the opinions of the rabbis that lived in about 100 years later that were living in the region of the Babylonian captivity. So there are some tractates of Mishnah that don't have Gemara at all. There are some tractates of Mishnah that only have Gemara in the Jerusalem Talmud, but not in the Babylonian Talmud. In the case of Tractate Checklist, we have no Gemara for it in the Babylonian Talmud, only in the Jerusalem Talmud. So, which is not as authoritative as the Babylonian Talmud. But we're going to look at the Mishnah. And in our study here, we're going to use Rashi to help us understand the rabbinic and therefore the Pharisaic position of on the temple tax verses of the Torah. So if you look at your handout, we have Mishnah Shekelim 1:1 and 1:3. It says, on the first day of Adar, they make public announcement concerning the payment of the shekel dues. So that's Mishnah Shekelim 1:1. On the first day of the month of Adar, which is the month before Nisan, the month in which Purim takes place, and the month before the month in which Passover takes place. So on the first day of the month of Adar, they criers, the town criers or whatever, they go out, they announce and they say, hey, look, get ready. The temple tax is going to be collected towards the end of this month. And so they basically say, remind everybody that the temple tax is due soon. Then Shekalim 1:3 says, on the 25th of Adar, they set up money changers' tables in the provinces. On the 25th of Adar, they set them up in the temple. Once they were set up in the temple, they began to extract pledges from those who had not paid the tax in specie. Okay. So here we have it was an annual thing for the Pharisees, and it took place in the month of Adar every year. We can get that from the Mishnah. There's a lot more information in the Mishnah. If you want to do a study on the customs surrounding the temple tax, you can do that. Now let's look at what Rashi writes in respect to our passage of Torah in Exodus chapter 30. Rashi says, when you take, now this is referring back to our passage in Exodus chapter 30, verse 12, where it says, when you take the sum of the children of Israel. In other words, when you make the annual census, when you make the census of the children of Israel, which is what this is referring to. It uses the word take, it says, when you take. And verse 16 then says, and you shall take the atonement money from the children of Israel. So Rashi is going to show or argue that when you take in verse 12 is related to when you take in verse 16. So let's see what Rashi says in his comment on when you take. It says, when you take, this is an expression of taking, as the Targum Onkelos renders. Now that's important. What is the Targum? The Targums are Aramaic paraphrases of books of the Tanakh that were made and read in the synagogues along with the Torah and half-Torah readings. And they were in Aramaic so that those that spoke Aramaic could understand them, and they were very paraphrased and interpretive. So they weren't literal translations like the Peshitta is a literal Aramaic translation of the Tanakh. These were paraphrases. So the paraphrase, Targum Onkelos, was the authoritative Targum for the Torah. And Targum Jonathan was the authoritative Targum for the Ketuvim. I'm sorry, for the Navaim. There was no complete Targum of the Ketuvim. All right, so Targum Onkelos renders this, or paraphrases it, when you wish to take the sum of the numbers to know how many they are, do not count them by the head, but each one shall give a half shekel, and you shall count the shekels. Thereby you will know their number. So what Rashi wants us to know here is that since based upon the Targum and the idea that we have when you take in verse 12 and you shall take the atonement money in verse 16, that the two takes are tied together. And Rashi will also explain this further when he comments on the passage, who goes through the counting, which is referring back to verse 14, I believe. Everyone that passes among them that are numbered. Everyone that passes among them that are numbered. That's the phrase that's really being referred to. Or everyone that passes among them in the previous verse that are numbered. Okay. So Rashi is explaining that the Hebrew here basically says they that pass under the Pekadim, it's customary for those who count to pass the ones who have um, been counted one following another. So if the word avar, avir, in avor, each one that passes under the rod, Leviticus 27:32. And so the word is flocks will again pass under the hands of the one who counts them. So what Rashi is saying is that as they pass under the rod, as they're being counted, they are paying the tax. So let's go back up and reread the verse of Exodus with this information. Verse 12, when you take the number of the children of Israel, paralleling with, and you shall take the atonement money from the children of Israel in verse 16, when you take the sum of the children of Israel according to their number, then shall they give every man a ransom for his soul unto Yahweh. When you number them, there be no plague among them when you number them. Verse 13, this they shall give, every one that passes among them that are numbered, half a shekel after the shekel of the sanctuary. The shekel is 20 gerahs, half a shekel for an offering to Yahweh. Everyone that passes among them that are numbered from 20 years old and upward shall give the offering of Yahweh. So what Rashi is basically saying here is that every year when the census is taken, and everyone that passes under the rod, when they pass as they pass under the rod, they pay the half shekel. And that because of that process, the priests didn't actually count the people. They waited till they were done and they counted the half shekels. And that's why it says when you take the sum of the children of Israel, there's taking involved. And verse 16, when you take the atonement money, when you're taking the atonement money in verse 16, you are taking the sum of the children of Israel in verse 12. So this is Rashi's understanding. This is the Pharisaic understanding of the passage. However, the Qumran community had a different position. In a document called, by the way, when I say the Qumran community, I mean the Essenes. We can do a whole video on how the Essenes were the Qumran community. I know there's all kinds of crazy theories going around, but it's very clear that the Essenes were the Qumran community, and the Qumran community were the Essenes. So we're talking here about Essene Halacha. So the phrase, a ransom for his soul, it says concerning the ransom. This is from a document called 4Q 159, which means 4Q means it was found in Cave 4, and 159 means it was document fragment 159, fragment 1, there's apparently more than one fragment to it, column 2, lines 6 through 7. Concerning the ransom, the money of the valuation which a man gives as ransom for his life or soul, his nephesh. That's an important factor here we're going to look at. The valuation which a man gives as ransom for his life shall be half a shekel in accordance with the shekel of the sanctuary. He shall give it only once in his life. That's the key phrase. He shall give it only once in his life. Now, the word for life here is, in Hebrew, nephesh. Nephesh is a Hebrew word that can mean soul, life, or self. It is the same word that is translated soul in verse 12 of Exodus 30, that the temple text is, quote, a ransom for his soul. And in verse 16 Well, actually, in several, verse 15, atonement for your souls. The word is nephesh. Um, and again, atonement for your souls in verse 16. And again, the word is nephesh, soul, life, or self. So the Qumran position is, the Essene halacha here is, they said, no, he ransoms his soul. A person ransoms their soul when they pay the half shekel temple tax. And so they do it only once in their lifetime, because you only have one soul, one life. It says you only have one nephesh, and you ransom it when you pay the temple tax. You're done. You paid it. You're ransomed. You're good. You don't have another soul to ransom the next year. You're done. That is the Essene position. It's clearly in complete conflict with the Pharisaic position. And apparently there was a ancestral remembrance, if you will, of the Essene position that comes down to Rashi. I'm going to do further research on this and see if I can find some stuff in the Halachic Midrashim as I put some of this material together and putting Yeshua's Halacha together. But Rashi seems to be aware of the Essene Halachic position because he responds to it. He doesn't actually present that interpretation, but he seems to be aware of it. He seems to feel like he needs to respond to it because he has an explanation for the phrase, to atone for your souls. Why does it say to atone for your souls? After all, one might argue that your soul is redeemed. It's already been ransomed. So why does it say that? So he says this was written because Elohim hinted to them, the Israelites, that there were here about 3 offerings, because an offering is made to the Lord is written here 3 times. The first represents the offering of silver for the sockets of the Mishkan. For he, Moshe, counted them, and when they commanded with the donations for the Mishkan, everyone gave a half shekel amounting to 100 talents. As it is said, and the silver of the community census was 100 talents. Exodus 38:25. The sockets were made from this. As it is said, 100 talents of silver were used to cast the sockets of the Mishkan and the sockets of the dividing curtain. Exodus 38:27. The Mishkan is the Tabernacle. The second offering mentioned here was also collected through counting, for he, Moshe, counted them after the Mishkan was erected. This is the counting mentioned in the beginning of the book of Numbers, on the first of the second month in the second year, Numbers 1:1. For this offering, everyone gave a half shekel, the total of which was earmarked for the purchase of communal sacrifices for every year. The rich and the poor were equal in them, i.e., they gave equally in these 2 offerings. Concerning that second offering, it is said to atone for your souls, because the sacrifices are brought for the purpose of atonement. The third offering is the offering for the Mishkan, as it is said, whoever set aside an offering of silver or copper. In this offering, not everyone gave the same amount, but each one gave according to what his heart inspired him to give. This is referring to Shekalim 2b, which is really just the Mishnah for Shekalim in the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, we want to key on this phrase, which I have bold-faced. For this offering, everyone gave a half shekel, the total of which was earmarked for the purchase of communal sacrifices for each year. This is referring back to our original reading here in Exodus chapter 30, where it says in verse 16, shall appoint it for the service of the tent of meeting. So the holy half shekel was appointed for the purpose of of the service in the tent of meeting. In other words, the offerings. Okay, and so Rashi is telling us that since this half shekel was earmarked for the purchase of the communal sacrifices for every year, uh, the rich and poor were equal in them. They gave equally in these two offerings. Concerning that second offering, it is said to atone for your souls. In other words, it is said that the holy half shekel is to atone for your souls because uh, it's earmarked for the offerings, for the sacrificial offerings that are for to atone for your souls. Okay, so that is Rashi's interpretation and the rabbinic position, and apparently the Pharisaic position. So the Pharisaic position here is that, in fact, let's go back and read through Exodus 30 again, verses 11 through 16, and review the positions of the Pharisees and the Essenes on the different passages and statements here. And you can see how each of their positions can be derived from the written Torah. Verse 12, when you take the sum of the children of Israel, the word take there tying in with the word take in 16, so Rashi says, based also on the Targum, that when they took the sum of the children of Israel, they were taking the atonement money from the children of Israel. They were taking the shekels when they were taking the census, so that as they passed under the rod to be counted, it was like a turnstile. And they were paying the half shekel as they went through the turnstile, as you will. And then when they were all done, the priests only had to count the half shekels to know how many were counted, how to accomplish the census. According to their number, then, shall they give every man a ransom for his soul. But the Essenes say a ransom for his soul means that his soul is ransomed, and he's only got one soul. He's only got one life. Once it's ransomed, it's ransomed. When you number them, that there be no plague among them when you number them. Verse 13, this they shall give every one that passes among them. So this they shall give every one that passes among them. So everyone that's counted pays the half shekel. Half a shekel after the shekel of the sanctuary. The shekel is 20 gerahs. Half a shekel is an offering for an offering to Yahweh. Everyone that passes among them that are numbered. So Rashi would say everyone. The Pharisees would say everyone that passes among them that are numbered from 20 years old and upward shall give the offering of Yahweh. Every one of them. Verse 15, the rich shall not give more, the poor shall not give less than the half shekel, when they give the offering of Yahweh to make atonement for your souls. But, wait a minute. The Essenes would say that once your souls are atoned, they're atoned. You don't have to do it annually. Verse 16, and you shall take the atonement money from the children of Israel, and shall appoint it for the service of the tent of meeting, that it may be a memorial for the children of Israel before Yahweh to make atonement for your souls. And once again, the Essenes would say, but it's making atonement for your souls. It makes atonement for your souls. It ransoms your soul. You only have one soul. Once it's done, it's done. Once in a lifetime. And the Pharisees would say, no. When it's everyone that passes among them, everyone that passes as they are numbered, when you take the numbering of the children, you're taking the atonement money and then you count it, and that tells you how many people were there. So it's done annually, and you pay annually. Otherwise, they couldn't accomplish that task that way. They'd be actually counting heads instead of counting coins. And so these are the two positions. And you can see how legitimately you can get to a conflict on this passage, and they did get to a conflict. And now, with an understanding of this conflict, let's go back and understand what Yeshua is saying. And I think now that you understand, in terms of the Second Temple era debate between the Essenes and the Pharisees concerning the temple tax, what Yeshua and Kepha are saying is going to make perfect sense. And when they had come into Kipharnachum, this is those that collect the temple tax that we were reading about in the Mishnah, that they make the announcement in Adar, and then they set up the tables, and they set about collecting the temple tax. So it's the month of Adar. They've come to in the provinces in Kipharnachum, and they that received the drachma, actually, the collectors of the temple tax, came near to Kepha, and they said to him, "Does your rabbi pay the drachma?" Why would they ask such a question? Well, of course they asked the question because there was a halachic dispute in the Second Temple era, and there were those that paid the drachma every year, that paid the temple tax every year based on the Pharisaic understanding expressed by Rashi, and there were those that paid only once in their lifetime based on the Essene understanding that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. By the way, Halacha was also rather fluid in the Second Temple era, and so there were probably some Pharisees, there were different schools of Pharisees that held to the Essene interpretation, and there may have been Essenes that held to the Pharisaic interpretation. May have been, that's less likely for cultural reasons of the time that are too deep to go into in this study. But now it makes perfect sense in verse 24 why they ask Kepha, "Does your rabbi pay the temple tax?" Maybe he doesn't. If he doesn't, it's not because he's a heretic. It's because maybe he's an Essene. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't a big conflict between Pharisees and Essenes, and the Essenes considered the Pharisees to be vipers and sons of darkness. And the Pharisees probably didn't see the Essenes too great either. And he said, certainly, as he came to the house of Yeshua, but he said, certainly, and as he came to the house, Yeshua prevented him, saying, "How seems it to you, Shimon? The kings of the earth, of whom do they receive tribute and custom? Of their own children or of strangers?" And Kepha said, "Of strangers." Then Yeshua said, "If so, the children are free." Now, is Yeshua saying, blah on the Torah? The Torah is wrong because the sons of the king, the children of the king, shouldn't be paying the temple tax, and they're members of his house, and only strangers should. No. What Yeshua is saying is that once one has paid, remember now, they're 30-ish, okay? They have paid the temple tax at least once in their lifetime at this point, at the age of 21, or at the age of 20, sorry, and what we would call 21. Am I saying that right? They might have been 19. And anyway, they would have paid the temple tax at least once in their lifetime. So, Yeshua is saying that since they've ransomed their nefesh, in ancient times and in war, one kingdom would, in war, capture prisoners. One army, one side, one nation would capture prisoners of war from the other, sometimes important persons, generals or kings. And in some cases, they would ransom them for tribute. Okay, so Yeshua is saying here that as having already paid the temple tax, their nephesh is redeemed. Their soul has been ransomed. And since their soul is ransomed, they're now children of the king, not strangers. And as children of the king, they don't owe the tax anymore because they've been ransomed. Only those that haven't been ransomed owe the ransom because you only have one nephesh. He's agreeing with the Essene position. He's agreeing with the position of the Essenes. So now we understand. And Yeshua sheds light on the reason, because although we could kind of read into it, the Essene position just didn't explain itself. It just said he pays it once in his lifetime. But we know here that Yeshua is saying, why? Because they're children of the king. They're not strangers, they're children of the king. And the children, because they've paid it once in their lifetime, and the children of the king, but you really have to have both of these texts together. You have to have the context of Second Temple era Judaism that we get from this Dead Sea Scroll fragment, and Yeshua's teaching on this issue, and they shed light on one another, and the fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls offers us cultural historical information that unlocks the meaning of what Yeshua is saying. But when Yeshua was saying it, when Matthew was writing it in the Second Temple era, it made perfect sense to the Jewish people that would be reading it at that time because they were aware of the conflict between Essenes and Pharisees about how we understand the temple tax and the passages in the Torah in Exodus 13 concerning the temple tax. Okay, there's more. Verse 27. Yeshua says, but in order that we may not provoke them, go you to the sea and cast the baited net, and take the fish that first comes up, and when you have opened its mouth, you will find a litra. That take and give to them for me and you. Now, this is actually very reminiscent of a passage or a story that we see in the Talmud. In the Babylonian Talmud, and it's in your handout on the next page, titled In the Mouth of a Fish. We have a very similar, well, I won't say, well, we have a similar account in the Babylonian Talmud on Shabbat, Shabbat, page 119a. It says, Joseph, who honors the Sabbaths, had in his victory a certain Gentile who owned much property. Soothsayers told him, Joseph, who honors the Sabbaths, will consume all your property. So he went, sold all of his property, and bought a precious stone with the proceeds, which he set in his turban. As he was crossing a bridge, the wind blew it off and cast it into the water, and a fish swallowed it. Subsequently, the fish was hauled up and brought to market on the Sabbath eve towards sunset. Who will buy now? Cried they. Go and take them to Joseph, who honors the Sabbaths, they were told, as he is accustomed to buy. So they took it to him. He bought it, opened it, found the jewel therein, and sold it for 13 roomfuls of gold denarii. A certain old man met him and said, He who lends to the Sabbath repays him. So it's interesting that we have, and I thought I would share with you, this interesting story in the Babylonian Talmud about a jewel found in the mouth of a fish, and how Elohim blessed a Torah-observant individual with this jewel in the mouth of a fish. And in this case, Yeshua, in a similar way, Yeshua and Kepha received a mitra that was found in the mouth of a fish. A gift from Elohim, in order for them to pay a temple tax that they really didn't owe according to their halacha, so that they may not provoke them, i.e. the Pharisees. Now this gives us another important halakhic principle of Yeshua, an extremely important one for us, particularly today as Nazarenes. It is permissible, as long as it doesn't violate other commandments of Torah, it is permissible to observe a halacha that is stricter than our own in order to maintain peace with the broader Jewish community. We see this is what Yeshua is doing here. Here, Yeshua and Kepha, they pay the temple tax that they don't owe under their halacha in order not to provoke the Pharisees, in order to maintain the shalom with them. That means that it is permissible. I'm not saying you have to do it, but it is permissible for a Nazarene to observe a stricter halacha in order to maintain unity with the broader Jewish community. A good example would be, particularly if you're living in Israel, it's permissible to maintain a kosher kitchen, even if your own halacha is such that you don't feel a need to separate meat from milk. That's another issue we can discuss sometime, but that would be an example. It's permissible to keep a stricter rabbinic halacha than the Nazarene halacha is, if doing so maintains unity with the community. And that doesn't mean that we change our teaching, change our actual position, but if we can maintain, and it does not mean violating Torah. That's another issue. Okay, so what have we learned? We've learned a lot. We've trashed a lot of material here out of Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 through 27. We've learned that this occasion took place in the month of Adar, towards the end of the month of Adar, leading up to Yeshua's crucifixion halfway through the month of Nisan. So this is less than a month from Yeshua's crucifixion. This helps us with chronology of the events of the four Gospels and the timeline, setting up the timeline of the events of the four Gospels. We learn that Yeshua agrees with the Essenes against the Pharisees on the issue of how often the temple tax is paid. Yeshua takes the position that the temple tax is owed only once in a lifetime. Nonetheless, Yeshua advocates going ahead and paying the temple tax, even if it's not owed, in order to maintain unity with the broader Jewish community. That's the lessons that we can take away from this, what we really, I think, learn from these passages. Okay, we also, I hopefully have an understanding of why the Pharisaic position is what it is, why the Essene position is what it is, and therefore also why Yeshua's position is what it is. All right, one more time, I want to remind you that we need your financial support. We have bills to pay, rent to pay, groceries to buy. So can't do this without you. This is a joint venture that I need your help with. So if you can please consider making a donation. This is a complete, unique ministry doing the kind of teaching that no one else does, possibly no one else can do. So, we each all have our unique talents and abilities, and this is one of what I've been gifted to do. So I share it with you. If you appreciate it, then perhaps you can help us out by sending donations to donations@wna.org. by PayPal or by clicking on the link at the description of this video and making a donation via that link. Really appreciate it, and I hope this study has been beneficial to you and given you a better understanding both of Yeshua's teaching in Matthew chapter 17 and the Torah's teaching in Exodus chapter 30. Shalom, everybody.